I'm Dean of the Kennedy School of Government, and it's my privilege to welcome you here this evening for the Gustav Pollock Lecture on Research in Government. This lectureship was established in 1951 as a memorial to Gustav Pollock, distinguished author and journalist who lived from 1849 to 1919. Under the terms of the endowment, the lecture is given, quote, from time to time by some qualified person to stimulate interest in government careers and research, but with a view to building a better government. Certainly tonight's guest has devoted his life to building a better government, but few of the distinguished lecturers who have filled this role before him have struggled for better government under more adverse circumstances than tonight's speaker. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to recognize some other distinguished guests that are here with us tonight. Franklin Sohn, the South African ambassador to the United States. Angelica Zander Rudenstein, the noted art historian who's also representing her husband, the president of Harvard, who couldn't be here because there's an off-site which he's involved in. Susan Weld of the law faculty at Boston University and a noted expert on China, who is here this evening. And a special welcome to Ethel Kennedy, whose husband, Robert Kennedy, did so much in the struggle against apartheid. Thabo Mbeki was born in 1942. Both of his parents were teachers and also political activists. His father, Governor Mbeki, was a leading intellectual in the African National Congress who was sentenced to prison with Nelson Mandela in 1964. Despite seeing firsthand what political activism might cost, Thabo Mbeki joined the ANC at the age of 14. When his school was closed due to a strike, Mr. Mbeki finished his studies on his own and obtained a high school diploma. He then moved to Johannesburg, where he became increasingly involved in political activities under the guidance of senior ANC officials. While studying for his British A-level exams and pursuing a correspondence course in economics with London University, Mr. Mbeki was elected National Secretary of the African Students Association. In 1962, he left South Africa on the instructions of the ANC as his political activities were placing him in increasing danger. He finished his education at Sussex University, completing a master's degree in economics in 1966. After his studies, he worked at the ANC office in London and represented the party in Botswana, Swaziland, Nigeria, and Zambia, eventually becoming the political secretary to Oliver Tambo, the party's president in exile. As Director of Information, Mr. Mbeki is credited with turning international opinion against apartheid, and he was one of the leaders who was involved in bringing about the end of apartheid in negotiations after 1990. In 1989, Mr. Mbeki was appointed head of the ANC's Department of International Affairs and was recently endorsed by Mr. Mandela to succeed him as president of the ANC. For those of us who over the years have sympathized with the cause of democracy in South Africa and who wondered when it would come and worried that it would not come this soon and worried that it would not come under such successful circumstances as it occurred, we owe a lot to Mr. Mbeki and the work that he and his colleagues have done, and it is truly a great pleasure for us to welcome him to the Kennedy School tonight. Thabo Mbeki, Deputy President of South Africa.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. A few months ago, I think it was it a few months ago almost when we were at Sussex? No. Okay. A year ago. A year ago, I went back to the University of Sussex in England, where I had last been in 1966, to get an honorary doctorate. It had puzzled me when I got this letter from the university to say the Senate have met and this, not any other, council and these people of this kind, and had decided to award you an honorary doctorate in philosophy or literature or something. I was puzzled why. So we went. I went to the university and they did the honors and donned all the robes, and they said, no, you see, you are a graduate of this university, and given what has happened to you, we thought you might be very useful in terms of fundraising for the university. And the dean has just said some nice things about me. And normally that happens when people owe me money and don't want to pay me. But let me start by thanking the university, and particularly the Kennedy School and the Harvard Institute of International Development, for inviting us to address what is clearly a very distinguished audience. I trust that you will excuse me for talking as though I were an intellectual, never mind what the University of Sussex thinks, to deal with some of the topics on our agenda. And perhaps then during question time we might deal with more of the rebels among our midst and do a little bit of agitation. Our government's ability and capacity to develop and implement strategies for social transformation, for reconstruction and development, such as those that are designed and explained in what indeed is called a Reconstruction and Development Program, and a more recently unveiled macroeconomic strategy, which is an element of that program. Both of those are determined by our history, the kind of society we want to build, and the nature of the post-Cold War global political economy. Our prospects for sustained reconstruction and development are not only largely dependent on the structure of the international economy and South Africa's place therein, but also on the international community's perceptions and response to domestic circumstances and the policies of the South African government. Therefore, when considering the domestic context and the conditions necessary to achieve just and equitable social development, we must build and entrench democratic institutions capable of sustaining that vision of a just and equitable social development. I think to this end, we therefore need to re-examine the meaning of and the relationship between such concepts as development, democracy, and good governance. In the 1980s and the 1990s, I think this would be true, this might be challenged by the people around this room, developmental orthodoxy moved away from the assumption that democracy is a logical outcome of development. I believe it is now widely understood that democracy and development and respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms are interdependent and mutually reinforcing. The human person should therefore be the central subject both as active participant and beneficiary of good governance. Respect for human rights, the application of the rule of law, as well as the possibility for the population freely to choose their government, we believe are indispensable foundations for the promotion of good governance. This enabling environment that governments must create is therefore essential for sustainable development. And I think it would also be accepted that good governance includes accountability, transparency, and must also be supported by a legal and regulatory framework which offers stability and predictability, both for civil society in general and for business. And I think, therefore, the point is correct that indisputably there is an interdependence between good governance and sustainable development. These are some of the considerations which, in the end, perhaps to some extent with hindsight, have informed the process of change that have taken place in South Africa, which political process has been described by some as a miracle. And yet we've inherited a country characterized by some of the highest levels of inequality in the world. And therefore, as a government, we've designed responses to redress imbalances, disparities, such as in per capita disposable income, infant mortality rates, unemployment, economic opportunities, access to essential services such as shelter, water, electricity, health, educational facilities. Faced with needs such as these, we could not but accept that the road to success lies in linking very closely the democratization process to social development, economic regeneration, and modernization. It may be difficult in certain instances to imagine this, but there are, I believe, few expressions of democracy in the world which, in a society such as ours, are as eloquent as new taps providing clean running water to those who formerly went without clean running water, and where new electrical connections to enhance the quality of life and provide opportunities for access to a better education and self-fulfillment become available. I may say this, that with regard to education, would like to thank the whole variety of educational institutions that are here in Massachusetts that donated 11 scholarships for South African students during Governor Wells' visit to our country last year. It is this vision which drives our government's reconstruction and development program, which is a program that addresses a whole variety of matters, including nation building, and geared to ensuring that social and economic development proceed in parallel, and that civil society plays an important role in the implementation and indeed the formulation of that program. It is therefore about transforming government and society. It is about providing basic needs and infrastructure to all through the opening and democratization of the whole of society. It is about making sure that government is responsive to people's needs and concerns. And it is about ensuring, which is very important, that the people themselves become involved in development and governance. It addresses human resource development at both basic and higher levels. And coming as we do out of a society that devalued and deliberately underdeveloped a huge section of our population, we have to focus more on developing our people as a mainstay of that democratic transition, as well as the most important asset in terms of the modernization of our society. That reconstruction and development program also focuses on building the capacity of our institutions and organs of civil society in order to guarantee that development is sustainable. These measures, we believe, will nurture a healthy, educated, better skilled, more productive society, which in turn contributes directly towards economic growth and improved economic efficiency. The redirection of resources to new and improved infrastructure, housing, for instance, and service provision, urban and rural development, land reform, represent a tangible post-apartheid dividend consistent with this objective of the restructuring of South African society. Particular processes that have taken place in the country which represent the consolidation of the democratic transition. And that includes, of course, the elections that have taken place at central and provincial and local government. Additionally, the parallel creation of institutions essential to modern democracies, such as the Office of the Public Protector, a Human Rights Commission, an open democracy bill to ensure accountable government, an independent constitutional court, and the entire judicial system, an electoral commission, and so on. All of these lay the foundations on which to establish a participatory democracy which is relevant to all South Africans. And combined with a healthy private sector and a vigorous civil society, our democratic institutions are structured so as to enable South Africans to redress in a participatory manner the negative effects of apartheid underdevelopment. It is our belief that in building these democratic institutions, we are building the bedrock upon which to give South Africans a direct stake both in government and in the economy. And therefore they become indeed both participant and beneficiary. Wherever applicable, joint policy discussion fora have been created to address a range of socio-economic issues, and through the process of submissions and hearings to parliamentary portfolio committees, the masses of the people are able to participate in the process of the formulation of policy. At the national level also, we have institutionalized the partnership between government and business and labor in the form of what is called the National Economic Development and Labor Council. And through this institution, these key stakeholders, together with community-based organizations, engage in policy formation and debate, and we believe that this further entrenches the practice of people participating in their own governance. This, we believe, constitutes an important part of good governance. By drawing government and civil society into a cooperative partnership, the process of formulating, articulating, and implementing policies necessary for growth and social upliftment is therefore predicated on achieving national consensus. I need to say this, that there's a price that we have to pay for that, which is that it then becomes difficult to arrive at decisions quickly. Because South Africans, I think much more so than Americans, South Africans think they have, every South African, ask the ambassador here, they all think they know everything about everything. So they want to be consulted. It's a participatory process, involvement of civil society. But it's important because in the end, particularly in a society in transition such as ours, where you've got to make these radical changes, it is important that there is the greatest possible national unity with regard to those decisions, because then you are able to produce a stable result. But really, in actual practical terms, it means a decision that I think can be taken in a day takes 6 months. But in the end, I think this is what guarantees the stability of the transition. The legitimacy afforded by such an approach, combined with the secure framework provided by stable government, by non-governmental and community-based organizations and institutions, we believe as men that South Africa is capable, therefore, of pursuing realistic policies supportive of economic growth and social upliftment. And in that context, I'm saying, therefore, that the preconditions for sustainable development are therefore largely in place in South Africa today. But of course, there is an international dimension to consider. And the rapid move towards the globalization of the world economy holds the inherent danger of the reduction of the capacity of governments to carry out their social responsibilities. While bearing in mind that the globalization process cannot be reversed, the challenge facing even governments of the industrialized countries is to define policies which mitigate the dangers and consequences of such social collapse as may result from the diminution of the capacity of governments to act within the specific national sovereign context. This means that the matter also needs to be addressed very consciously of ensuring that the gap does not grow between the successful and those who are struggling to extricate themselves from the poverty trap. As we have said before, our own prospects for sustained reconstruction and development depend in part on our ability to integrate into the global economy and our capacity to address successfully, together with the rest of the African continent, this very important question of the marginalization of the continent of Africa. And given the constraints imposed by the global economy on the sovereignty of developing states, there is often a fundamental conflict between economic liberalization and political emancipation. The pressures placed on developing nations by the global economy can have detrimental effects on the state's capacities to provide and maintain basic services and infrastructure relating to social welfare, to health, education, and so on. And of course, these pressures would then generate social, economic, and political stresses. And when combined with a weak state and civil society, civil society institutions, these stresses may lead to repression, or at least a backsliding in terms of civil liberties. And we know where that kind of road leads to in the end. And therefore, in this context, South Africa and the Southern African region are making concerted efforts to strengthen and consolidate regional and domestic institutions. As a region, we are battling resolutely to emerge from a sustained period of resource-sapping violence and political and economic destabilization caused by many factors, including the apartheid government's foreign and security policies. And South Africa's transition to democracy and the ending of civil wars in Angola and Mozambique are part of the wider, we believe, global processes that have begun to liberate the region's previously tied up energies and resources. Many of the political and economic constraints imposed on the Southern African region during the former period are either disappearing or at least becoming more manageable. The region can now confront the substantive challenges of building democracy and development, challenges which were not always granted the attention that they deserved on the subcontinent, because states were more often than not preoccupied with the struggle for their very survival. And now that South Africa shares with its neighbors the same imperatives of reconstruction, of development, of social transformation, the region's consensus around the need for balanced economic development with social progress in an integrated Southern African region has gained fresh impetus. In pursuit of regional consensus, we ourselves as South Africa have pledged to shoulder our responsibilities in this regard, and indeed to exercise what we might consider to be our rights in a rational and a judicious and a non-threatening manner. As an equal partner in the region, South Africa believes that all relations should be based on reciprocity and that common regional policies will develop in a culture of consultation and negotiation. In turn, regional policymakers will likewise be mindful of supportive strategies originating from partners and friends within the continent and the wider international community. What we're trying to say was expressed by Nelson Mandela when he said, "We in South Africa have learned through bitter experience that security for a few is in fact insecurity for all." The recognition of the interdependent character of the region and its dependence on the world economy has led all of us to acknowledge the fact that socio-economic progress in South Africa is largely dependent on the region achieving sustainable economic growth in a stable, democratic, and peaceful environment. And in order to facilitate the interrelated goals of promoting and maintaining regional democracy, political stability, and sustainable economic growth, South Africa and the region have therefore embraced two long-term, mutually reinforcing objectives. And these are: one, to promote a common regional trade and development strategy, which will promote interregional integration and the integration of the region with the global economy on an equitable footing by means of redirecting regional resources towards sustainable development, addressing poverty, and the procurement of productive investment. And secondly, to encourage the evolution of a common regional foreign policy and security approach in order to promote and maintain a stable, democratic, and peaceful regional environment. Given the Southern African region's susceptibility to external shocks and the fact that existing collective resources are at present underdeveloped and inadequate to meet fully our developmental needs, South Africa and the rest of the countries of our region will seek to ensure that indeed regional undertakings to coordinate and integrate policy acknowledge initiatives stemming from the African continent and the broader international community. And while recognizing that developing countries cannot depend exclusively on the developed world and the developed world to serve as a catalyst for growth, African leaders realize that only themselves and their people should determine the needs of the continent and must take responsibility for their own development. The developed world needs, however, to form a partnership with the continent to achieve these goals. The challenge that South Africa and its partners in the region of Southern Africa and the continent of Africa face is therefore to ensure that sustainable policies of development and economic growth are in place, and most important, to build the democratic institutions that will guarantee good governance. The integration of our country and continent into the world economy can no longer be an integration which is defined in practice by the continent's marginalization. As Africans, we want to say it would be important that we define the 21st century as the African century. That it ought not to be permitted that we talk of development in the Asia-Pacific region, in South America, in Eastern Europe, in the rest of the world, and allow that the process of the marginalization of the African continent continues. We trust that the Olympic Games of the year 2004 will come to South Africa. And come to South Africa not as the Cape Town Olympics or the South African Olympics, but as the African Olympics. As a token by the rest of the world that this fifth ring in that Olympic emblem is filled, is occupied, because that fifth ring is the African ring. That this will become a signal that the rest of the world is saying, building from this great success that all of us achieved in ending the system of apartheid and enabling these processes that I've been trying to describe as a result, that would take this additional step to say, building on all of that, let's make sure that this new century is a century that results in development, in good governance, in democracy, and prosperity also for the peoples of the African continent. Thank you very much.
Mr. Mbeki has agreed to answer some questions. We have here on the floor 2 microphones. If people would like to line up behind them, we'll take questions in order. There are also 2 microphones on the balcony. And then we're also going to have a question brought into us from the Internet, because this has been carried on the Internet tonight. But let's start very locally with right here.
Thank you. You spoke quite eloquently of the African century, and I would be quite interested in your thoughts on what role, if any, South Africa will play in the redistribution of wealth in the country and providing a moral leadership for the continent in dealing with difficult transitions such as your country is facing.
One of the principal challenges that we face as a country is to transform South Africa into a non-racial democracy, to end the legacy of apartheid. And part of that legacy, as we indicated briefly in the statement, has to do with this unequal distribution of wealth, of income, of opportunity in that society. You couldn't say that South Africa had become a non-racial society simply because you have a Nelson Mandela as president. So these matters become fundamental to the creation of that non-racial society. And indeed, I think become fundamental to the guarantee of the stability of the democratic settlement, that you must address these racial imbalances. Now, there's a whole range of things that need to be done with regard to that. To do with education, to make sure that you raise the general educational and skills levels, particularly of the sections of our population that have been disadvantaged. To deal with matters of developing black entrepreneurs so that the black people can enter the economy in greater numbers in ways other than as consumers and workers. As an important element of this particular process. It has to do with ensuring that the state practices, whether it's by way of tendering, for instance, that your tendering systems address questions like this of empowerment of people who had previously been disempowered. So those things are happening. Those things are happening and need to happen, but certainly in the interests of South Africa, not necessarily to give any lead to the rest of the world or the rest of the continent. As for the rest of the continent, I think the understanding has evolved within the continent that indeed these matters of development, of good governance, of freedom for the people, of democracy, all of these matters are interrelated. And that they have to be addressed by the African peoples themselves as part of an indigenous process of development rather than a process that's forced on them from outside. And I think that what you see, certainly what you see in the region of Southern Africa is precisely that. That people are grappling with this issue. We've got a monarchy in our region, Swaziland. And I know the king grapples with this matter to say, but I'm surrounded all around Swaziland by people who are establishing democracies. What do we do with Swaziland? So they try various experiments to find a way to ensure that Swaziland itself gets transformed into a democracy. That's a good thing. So I'm saying that that process is happening, and most certainly to the extent that South Africa can lend its support directly or can, by example, demonstrate what can be done, we would be happy to do either. But I'm saying a critical element is that the processes need to be homegrown for them to enjoy legitimacy and permanence. People must feel that we've designed this thing ourselves. You know what happened in South Africa. We had to say, for instance, we needed a government of national unity over a certain period of time. But it was entirely a South African decision because we understood that if we didn't go that particular route, we might indeed be perpetuating a conflict. But that's something the South Africans arrived at by themselves. And when they decided that they were fed up of being together with one another in one government, they say, okay, goodbye. But that's a South African decision. But it enabled us, it had enabled us to go through this difficult transition period with all of the major political forces cooperating to take the country forward. So I'm saying whatever might be done or said by South Africans, in the end, what we'd want to encourage is that genuine, real, actual democratic systems and developmental processes should have this feature of emerging from the people themselves.
Yes. My name is Elias. As a South African, I'm a bit worried because now recently the majority of the rich white South Africans staying in the elite suburbs have declared their intention to embark on a boycott on paying for the taxes and the rates. And this worries me because the taxes and rates that are being raised from these people forms a great part of the source of the income to the state, which enables the state to carry some of its macroeconomic policies. Now I'm worried, and I would like to know from our honorable Deputy President. From our honorable Deputy President, what will the government do with this? What measures does the government intend to take to discourage the culture of learning from these people?
Well, I think the first thing that we need to say with regard to that is that, well, that's part of the price you've got to pay for instituting a democratic system. You've never ever had a rent boycott or a bond boycott or a rates boycott from white society in all of these years that we had apartheid, but liberation enables them to do that, so it's fine. No, I think one should expect that you are going to have these kinds of stresses and strains because as part of the transformation of South African society, even the question of the creation of one non-racial city is going to present you with lots of challenges, where you bring together this white section, rich, and this black section, poor, and to say, how do you finance local government? It must entail transfers of resources from one area to the other. And in that situation, you can't expect that there wouldn't be tension, conflict. I'm not talking about violence, but a vigorous debate as to what is possible and what is correct and so on. So I wouldn't worry terribly much about it. The matter will be dealt with in the context of this democratic discussion. I was told, for instance, that for the first time, part of what is happening has been a proper valuation of these properties. And where you said the rates that are payable are such and such a proportion, a percentage of whatever the value is, where you get a proper rating, a determination of the value of these properties, and therefore that this is the correct rate. Happening for the first time, indeed you get this rebellion. But I think in the end, and then people will understand that, you might have to pay a little higher rates, but in return, you contribute thereby to stability, to peace, to an absence of conflict, to an absence of tension which arises out of these disparities in terms of distribution of wealth. And I think the white ratepayers would in the end understand that.
As I mentioned earlier, we are simulcasting this, or Prodigy is simulcasting this on the internet, and we have a question that has been raised through the internet. So we will go beyond Cambridge, Massachusetts to the question, which is, in 1969, I was in the first Peace Corps contingent in Swaziland. The program has just ended. Do you see a role for the Peace Corps in the Republic of South Africa?
Well, we do have an agreement. We have an agreement with the United States government concerning the Peace Corps. And that agreement is that indeed we should access the Peace Corps in terms of the development needs of South Africa. So it's an agreement. It's part of the agreements that fall under the binational commission between South Africa and the United States. So what would then happen is that we would identify such needs, human power needs, such as we might need, and therefore be able to access such people as might be in the Peace Corps would be able to come and make that kind of contribution. So there's a formal agreement about this, and the necessary procedures agreed as to how to proceed with regard to using people in South Africa who might be in the Peace Corps.
Next question in the right side of the balcony.
Good evening. Can you please comment on the ANC's current relationship with some of the other dominant political parties, including the NP and the IFP?
The ANC's relations. Well, the National Party has, as you know, it left the government of national unity and said that it wanted to play a role as an opposition party. So the relationship between the ANC and the National Party would be a relationship between a ruling party and an opposition party. The IFP decided to stay in the government of national unity at the national level. The ANC decided to stay in the government of provincial unity in the province of KwaZulu-Natal, where the IFP is the majority party. So those two parties are cooperating in terms of the governing of the country at both national and provincial level.
I guess I was getting at, everyone knows that there's high levels of political violence in the region of KwaZulu-Natal, and just how the ANC is dealing with, some of the tension. I know that some of the tension is actually ethnic in nature, so maybe you can comment on that.
Well, I don't know how one would describe the tension in, for instance, in the province of KwaZulu-Natal as being ethnic, because 98% of the African population in the province is all Zulu-speaking. So there's no ethnic tension among people who are part of the same ethnic group. So no, it's not ethnic tension. The tension that there has been political. People taking different political positions. You do not have any situation in South Africa, I don't believe that you have it anywhere in the world, where to belong to a particular ethnic group defines also your political beliefs. There could never be such a thing as all Zulus are members of the IFP or all Zulus are members of the ANC. Couldn't happen. They are, like the rest of the population, divided among these various parties. The level of political violence in the province of KwaZulu-Natal has dropped very, very significantly. The last elections to take place in the province took place on the 26th of June this year, local government elections. And those elections took place in conditions of peace. There was no problem, and people voted. And that signifies the level to which the political violence has dropped. The IFP and the ANC in that province have taken a decision jointly to participate in a process which would address the question of violence, so that they go out together, the ANC and the IFP, to their branches, to local communities, to say an end to this political conflict. And finally, the police. The police have been doing a lot of work around this particular issue of making sure that they arrest and prosecute those people responsible for this political violence. So you have the fortunate situation now in South Africa that you hardly ever see any report in the newspapers which says there was political violence in the province of KwaZulu-Natal as a result of which so many people were killed or whatever. It is actually reduced and is continuing to decline in this province. But as I say, part of that is as a result of the ANC and the IFP agreeing to act together, to go to their membership to say an end to this violence. So that is part of what would define the political relationship between the ANC and the IFP.
Left balcony.
Mr. Deputy President, there's little doubt that South Africa and its struggle for democracy serves as a beacon of hope for those Africans which continue to struggle and suffer under repressive governments in the African continent. There's also little doubt that the South African economy is the engine of economic growth for the Southern Africa region, if not the continent as well. Given the prominent role of economic sanctions in South Africa's struggle for democracy, is the South African government able or willing to combine economic sanctions against those African countries, African neighbors, who continue to avoid democratic and participatory governance?
I don't believe that we would take a position that in all situations it is necessary to impose sanctions. In 1994, I think it was, or 95, we were faced with a situation, for instance, where a royal coup d'etat took place in Lesotho. The legitimate elected government of Lesotho was replaced by the soldiers who said that they supported the king, the soldiers and the police. Now, you know how Lesotho is located in the middle of South Africa there, and therefore quite very, very easy in terms of imposition of sanctions. We took the decision not to impose sanctions against Lesotho, but that we would use other means to ensure the restoration of democracy, which is what happened, and democracy was restored. And so I'm saying that I don't think we would come to the position that in all circumstances you use sanctions, because you can indeed, I think, produce the sorts of results that you might need by resort to other means other than sanctions, depending on the nature of the situation. But I think what would be correct would be to say that it would be necessary for a country such as South Africa not to keep quiet and stand aside where something was going fundamentally wrong somewhere on the continent. Quite what you then do about a specific situation, I think, depends on the situation. But it's not as though each time a head drops, you then say, let's impose sanctions.
Right here, on the floor.
Sawubona, good evening, Mr. Deputy President. You talked about reconstruction and development at the economic and political level, but there has also been a reconstruction at the ethical and moral level going on in the country. Mr. Deputy President, there is a perception that in demoting and subsequently placing Bantu Holomisa's membership of ANC under question, that the ANC is in effect policing the submissions of its members to the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, which it actually set up, or was a driving force in setting up, while encouraging others to come clean voluntarily. How has the ANC responded to such criticism?
Well, essentially, the ANC hasn't responded to such criticism. And really, the reason for that was because we instituted, in terms of the constitution of the ANC, we instituted various disciplinary measures. And the general idea was that it would be necessary to allow those disciplinary measures to run their course, and whatever decision taken that would come out of those processes. And after that, we can then all comment on this. That's basically the position that's been taken. So Bantu Holomisa has had somewhat of a field day saying whatever he wanted to say. But I can say this. We had a meeting with the Archbishop Tutu and the Deputy Chairperson of the Truth Commission, Dr. Borain, about this matter when it first arose. And we said to them that we were not by any means stopping Bantu Holomisa or any other member of the ANC from going to the Truth Commission. You had a rather peculiar circumstance, which is this, that President Mandela appoints his cabinet in May 1994, including the then Deputy Minister Holomisa, including Minister of Public Enterprises Stella Skau. That's May 1994. Bantu Holomisa goes to the Truth Commission whenever it was, April or something this year. Say 2 years later. He then says at the commission, at the Truth Commission, that Minister Stella Stow received a bribe in the 80s. The consequence of which is that the opposition parties then say, how can President Mandela appoint a corrupt minister? We demand that a parliamentary debate on this matter take place. We then decide that the government should make a statement to Parliament about this issue, which we do. And essentially the statement is to say there was a judicial commission of inquiry which went into this matter about which charge is made. And the judicial commission found that this money had not been corruptly received by Minister Stella Stow. At which point the opposition parties in Parliament then say, but how can the Honorable Bantu Holomisa make statements of this kind against a fellow minister? Did he raise these questions with the President? Because after all, they belong to the same party. Why did he wait for 2 years if he's known all of this time that this minister was corrupt? If he had this information, why doesn't he in the first instance say, Mr. President, your minister is corrupt? Why does he inform the President via the Truth Commission? In any case, the Truth Commission is not appointed to deal with matters of corruption. It's appointed to deal with matters of gross violations of human rights. Now, these are circumstances of all of this. So the parliamentary parties, opposition parties, say, surely you cannot have government conducted in this way by which a government minister publicly attacks another government minister, does not go to the President. Surely government can't allow this kind of indiscipline. Now, that's the issue that arose. It was not the fact of going to the Truth Commission. It was a matter of how this particular issue was raised. I'm describing to you the circumstances and the sequence of events. The disciplinary process is still on course, so the ANC does not make a statement about the matter.
Bonga.
Good evening. My name is Sherry Zalika Sykes, and I have a question regarding the increased intervention of the UN in civil matters all around the world, and your statement that in the 21st century it's time for Africa to become out of the margins of international affairs and the economy. South Africa did not have either the benefit or the interference, depending on how one might want to look at it, of UN intervention. How would you see UN intervention in civil matters on the African continent over the next while?
Well, I'm not sure that it is correct to say that we did not have the benefit of UN. Well, okay, yeah, you were quite right in that instance. No, in a situation, well, let me say, you've had an end to the Cold War. And there's a system of international relations that is being born in the context of that post-war world. And our own belief would be that the United Nations gains in importance in terms of ensuring that even the smaller countries are able to make an impact in terms of the process of international governance. and therefore the instrument of the United Nations becomes even more important. We therefore would indeed want to see the United Nations acting in an effective manner with regard to addressing these African problems. Because in reality, if you looked at the entirety of all the major questions that face the African continent, there is a UN resolution, there was a UN conference that was held, all the policy positions are in place. And what remains outstanding is the ways and means by which to translate those policies into real action. So I'm saying that we would want to ensure that indeed the United Nations plays its role in terms of the implementation of its own decisions with regard to the African continent, with regard to all matters. But at the same time, we must also ensure that as African countries, as African peoples, we don't approach these issues, whether of peace or of development and so on, in a sense with a begging bowl. Please come and do the following thing, that we as Africans must say, what do we do? There's been the debate that's been going on between a number of African countries, including South Africa, with the United Nations about what to do about Burundi. United Nations has been talking about the possibility of constituting a military group to go into Burundi. I've approached South Africa, I've approached a number of countries. And the question that we've been asking is, if you put together a UN military force to go into Burundi, what would it be doing in Burundi? And this question has not been answered. And we are saying, in particular, taking the positions of the countries around Burundi, the Great Lakes region, and they are saying those countries, two things need to happen, well, not two, a number of things. One, let's impose sanctions. And we can, as the neighboring countries, impose those sanctions, which they have done. Second, let us insist that the democratically elected government and the parliament must be brought back into place in Burundi. And third, let us enter into a process of negotiations which will be inclusive of all the political factions in Burundi, in order to see whether we cannot find a solution agreed by all the people of Burundi. As you can see, nobody at this point is talking about a military presence. And it may very well be then that in the process of finding that political settlement, you then define the role of the military. In which instance, all of us have said we would then be prepared to move as African countries to provide these forces in order to do that. So I'm saying that we're not only saying the United Nations must discharge its responsibilities towards the African continent, but must also say that as Africans, we must also participate in the finding of these solutions, and not merely say to the rest of the world, please come and act, and the rest of us are really here to plead and beg and so on, because there is something that we can do.
There are many questions left, but alas, we've run out of time. The only time we have left is to thank Deputy President Mbeki for being with us this evening and to express our wishes for the continuing success of the wonderful experiment in South Africa.